Penguin Random House Audio presents The Hangman and His Wife, The Life and Death of Reinhard Heydrich by Nancy Dougherty. Read for you by Suzanne Toren. Foreword by Christopher Lehman Haupt. Nancy Dougherty traveled a long and circuitous route to arrive at the writing of The Hangman and His Wife. Admittedly, yet another among thousands of books about Nazi Germany, as well as one of several dozen volumes on Reinhard Heydrich, whom Adolf Hitler himself called the man with the iron heart, and who, as Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, was the top Nazi trusted by Hitler most with the leadership of another country. Yet this book is unique in being a portrait of a leading Nazi figure based, in part, on interviews with his wife, Lina von Osten-Heydrich, who survived him by more than 4 decades, well into the latter half of the 20th century. Nancy Dougherty's long journey into the heart of Nazi evil began with her childhood experience of World War II on the remote home front of Midwestern America. Then, as an 11-year-old in 1950, she was shocked by the war's physical damage by seeing firsthand the bombed remains of Cologne, Germany. Much later, in college, as a student of modern European history, she searched for why wars were fought at all, which prompted her to write her senior thesis on the Nuremberg war trials. From there, her dismayed curiosity led her to the German concentration camps, to the guards who manned them, to their boss, Adolf Eichmann, to his boss, the enigmatic Heydrich, and finally to the Baltic island of Fehmarn, where Heydrich's widow agreed to be interviewed at length. True, while Frau Heydrich loved and supported the man who can be described as the designer and executor of the Holocaust, and was called the Butcher of Prague, she was never herself, even socially, part of the Nazi leadership's inner circle. And though she must have seen him change over the years, she did not ever participate in, or even witness at first hand, the process of decision-making that defined the horrors of the Nazi era. Still, her presence here, as Heydrich's spouse, domestic partner, and mother of his children, casts light by her very existence on the course of Heydrich's career and the nature of his monstrous evil. During the 3 occasions in the 1970s and 1980s that Nancy Dougherty visited and interviewed Lina Heydrich at her various homes, she succeeded in peeling away the many layers of her subject's personality, slowly exposing her shocking, if unsurprising, interior. Sadly, Nancy Dougherty succumbed to Alzheimer's disease before completing a final draft of her biography. So my task as the editor engaged by her husband after her death has been to sharpen and highlight her all but tragic vision of Heydrich's descent into profound evil. At the time I was approached, I was in the midst of writing a book about a year living in Berlin right after World War II. There, as a 12-year-old, I became physically familiar with the Wannsee, the large lake in Berlin's suburbs, by learning to sail on it. But I never once heard of the meeting held nearby 5 years earlier, the so-called Wannsee Conference, purportedly intended to settle on a final solution of the Jewish question, and presided over by Heydrich. Many years later, when I finally learned of the conference and discovered Heydrich's role as an enemy of anyone even partly Jewish, I was prompted by my own German-Jewish ancestry to write a memoir. Oddly enough, whenever I would mention Heydrich as the reason I had interrupted work on that memoir, I was often greeted by silence. At first I interpreted this as stunned horror at the very thought of the man, but after a time I found that in a surprisingly large number of cases, people either hadn't heard of Heydrich, or weren't quite sure who exactly he was. This is puzzling, because while Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and Himmler remain vividly grotesque images of evil in the minds even of people born after these barbarians ceased to bestride Europe, Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich, in a number of respects, surpassed them in frightfulness. Dubbed the Blonde Beast, as well as the Butcher of Prague and the Hangman, and evincing a chiseled physiognomy, blonde hair, blue eyes, aquiline nose, Heydrich possessed also athletic skills. He was a near Olympic-level fencer and an able pilot. Musical talent, he played the violin well. A photographic memory, his subordinates characterized him as a human filing cabinet. And a keen sense of German culture. His father was a composer and opera singer good enough to study with Richard Wagner's widow Cosima at the Wagner Festival House in Bayreuth. Moreover, while at various times during the Nazi era, Hermann Göring, Martin Bormann, Albert Speer, Joseph Goebbels, and Karl Dönitz each became a candidate to succeed Hitler, Heydrich, as the leader of Bohemia and Moravia, and about to be put in charge of Nazi-occupied France when he was assassinated in the spring of 1942, possessed possibly better credentials to become Nazi Germany's next Führer. In the course of The Hangman and His Wife, we come face to face with the embodiment of the Nazi ideal of the Aryan master race. In Nancy Dougherty's handling of Heydrich's career, particularly in her treatment of the Wannsee Conference, held on January 20, 1942, a few months before Heydrich would be assassinated, we come to grips with the existential question of whether the Nazis embodied evil in their very being, or whether they were human beings who turned bad. In telling Reinhard Heydrich's story, largely in her own words, but with commentary by his widow, we meet someone who at first appears to be a quintessentially cultured and talented German, who was buffeted by the storms of 20th century history and, bit by circumstantial bit, turned from an ambitious and talented naval officer into the architect and engineer of Hitler's Holocaust. Yet one searches in vain for a rational explanation of Heydrich's descent into evil. No single biographical fragment satisfies. Not his awkward, ugly duckling childhood and adolescence. Not the sudden flame-out of his promising naval career. Not the seemingly hopeless job prospects he suddenly faced in 1931 as an untrained civilian, what with the deadly combination of hyperinflation and unemployment corroding Germany's economy. Not the attraction to Nazism of his fiancée and her father. Not the rising contempt for the Weimar Constitution's experiment in democracy. Not Heydrich's experience fighting in the Freikorps, Free Corps, the right-wing paramilitary volunteer group that fought leftist elements during the Weimar period. Not the rumor of a strain of Jewishness inherited from his father's side, the rumor at that time amounting, for all intents and purposes, to established fact. Not even the inclination in the German character to excel at any job, regardless of its purpose. Not one of these details suffices, not singly, nor as a symphony of evidence orchestrated in cacophonic discord. Reinhard Heydrich's monstrosity surpasses experiential evidence. His career puts one finely in mind of the controversial experiment designed in the 1960s by Stanley Milgram, a Yale University social psychologist, and described in his book Obedience to Authority, An Experimental View. Here, it was determined that under carefully controlled circumstances, where subjects were ordered to administer what they believed to be extremely painful electric shocks in order to teach victims random word associations, 60% of the subjects continued to obey the experimenter's commands despite the evident...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?